Fabricadabra at LPL presents embroidery stitches for Constellation animals. The first thing I'd like to do is thread the needle and tie the knot. So we begin with our embroidery needle and our embroidery floss. And then I try to sort of wet or use a little Vaseline on the tip and flatten it so that I can get it through the eye of the needle. Pull it through. And now we're going to tie the knot on the other end. And it's a simple procedure. You're just going to wrap it around your finger once and then put it through the hole. Put the end of the floss through the hole and pull it until there's a knot. Next is the stab stitch. Okay, for the stab stitch, I'm going to start with our needle and some felt. I'm going to start from the back as always, come up through the back, and then we're going to make a very tiny stitch. So it's basically kind of like a really super tiny straight stitch. So I'm going to pull it, and then I'm going to go just a little bit further away from where I came up, and I'm going to go back down. And pull that knot loose, and there we go. So that is your stab stitch. And typically you would do this with, like, I'm using white felt here, so I would do this with a white floss so that it doesn't show up very much. I'm doing it for this purpose right now so that you can see it. I'm using a navy thread, or actually a black thread. And so I just came up from the back, went one tiny little stitch over from where I was doing, where I came up, and I go back down. And that's what I'm doing again here. And then you just pull it tight. There we go. Came up, one tiny stitch over, and then you just pull it through. And I'm going to show you one more time. It's really a very easy stitch to do. And this is just for tacking things down where you don't want to see that you've tacked it down. Okay, and that's the stab stitch. Next up is the back stitch. Okay, so we're going to come up from the back as usual. And if you've done other Fabricadabra, you'll have seen this before. We're going to go ahead one stitch, pull it all the way through, and then from the back we're going to go ahead another stitch. Okay, and then we're going to bring the floss back to the end of the previous stitch we've done, just like this, and we're going to go down through that. Hence why it's called the back stitch, because you go forward, but then you go back, and then you go forward again and you go back. So here we go. I'm coming up forward from underneath, one stitch length, and then I'm going to go back to the end of the previous stitch, and I'm going to go back down through. And we're just going to do maybe a couple more stitches. So maybe just one more stitch, just to show you again. Come up from the back, a stitch length ahead, go backwards to the end of the previous stitch, and there you go. Next is the split stitch. For the split stitch, we're going to come up from the back, and then we're going to go ahead one stitch length and pull it through. And then instead of a back stitch, okay, this is where the split comes in. We're going to go about in the middle of the stitch. We're going to come up in the middle of that first stitch, but we're going to come up through the back. So we're going to split the threads of the stitch and come up through the middle of it. and then we're going to go ahead 1 stitch. So you see how we've come up through the middle, and now again we're going to go ahead 1 stitch. And I think I'll do a few more of these just to show you. So we're going to come up again through the middle. We're splitting the threads of the stitch. So we're splitting that stitch almost in half to come up through about the middle of it. And then just pull it through. And then here we go again. Go forward 1 stitch length. Go down through the front, pull it all the way through and taut, and then from underneath you're going to come up in the middle of that stitch. Hence why they call it the split stitch. You're splitting your stitches. And this is just a decorative stitch. The back stitch and this one are decorative stitches, but they can also be used to hold 2 pieces together. It's kind of up to you how you want to use them. You don't just have to do lines with them. You can do circles, triangles, squares, whatever you like. And that's my final stitch. And that is the split stitch. The straight and star stitches. These 2 are actually related. The star stitch is basically made from 3 different straight stitches. So here's our first straight stitch that we're going to do. Come up from the bottom and go as long as you want it. You don't have to make it big like I'm making it here. You can make it smaller. So I went up, basically an up and down upright line, and now I'm going to come up from the bottom to the side of the end of that line. And then I'm going to pull it across that middle line and go down near the beginning of that line. Just like this. Kind of makes almost an X. Now I'm going to do the same thing from the other side. Come up from the back near the end of the middle stitch and then go back down on the other side of it from near the beginning of that stitch, that middle stitch. Next is a satin stitch. This is a great stitch for filling in areas. People will use it to fill in circles or other larger areas in an embroidery pattern. So basically you'll see I've drawn a little circle, and certainly not a perfect circle. And now I'm going to fill it in with a satin stitch. And a satin stitch is literally just straight stitches right next to each other, very close. So I don't always start at the end. I usually start kind of partially near the end, one end of the circle or not, and then I work my way to one side of it and then work my way back to the other side. So I made a straight stitch, and now I'm coming up right next to the beginning of the first straight stitch, and I'm going down through the end of that first straight stitch. Okay, and it's a little bit off. You're trying to keep them straight right next to each other. And then as you can see, I came up a little bit, I'm making like a shorter straight stitch right next to it because it's a circle, so it's going to have smaller stitches on the outside, and then towards the middle you'll have the larger stitches, and then it'll go back down to smaller again. Okay. And I'm just going to do a few more to fill out this circle. And so for the constellation animal purposes, these would make, you could make eyeballs, you could make noses, you could just make any number of things using the satin stitch. And now we're almost done. We're going to do a French knot. So the French knot starts from the back, as always. You come up through the back of the felt or the fabric. You're going to pull it all the way through, and then you're going to place it down on your table, and you're going to wrap the floss around twice on the tip of your needle. So I'm going to show you again. Wrap it, and then wrap it again. And then you're going to push that needle back down near the same hole that you came up through. And while you're doing this, then you're going to pull it through. And while you're doing this, you're going to kind of hold on to one thread side of that loop until you get close to the knot, and then you're just going to pull it all the way through. And there's your first knot. I'm going to make a couple more so you can see what I'm doing. Sorry for the shaky hands. Okay, wrap and wrap again, and then back through, down through near the same hole that you came up. And these are also good for making tiny dots, and so like some of the eyes are very tiny, and you could use a French knot instead of satin stitch to make those eyes, if you want to make eyes. And here's our final French knot. Come up through the back, place it on our table, then we're going to wrap the floss twice around the tip of our needle, and then back down near the hole that we came up through. And there we go. We have 3 little French knots. Next is the whip stitch. And this is our final stitch that I'll show you. And this is great for putting 2 pieces together. So you want to hold these 2 pieces together. And this will be when you finish, when you put the front piece of your constellation animal to the back piece of the constellation animal. So you're going to start from the inside, in between the 2 pieces of felt. And that's where you'll hide your knot. I don't have a knot on mine, but this is just to show you how it's done. So then you're going to wrap around the outside edge and then come back up through the bottom. And so you'll see I pulled that out, and the next stitch I do is actually going to look a little bit better. So come up through the back around the edge and then pull it tight. It's really simple to do. It doesn't take hardly any time. And it also looks nice. So you could use a contrasting thread if you wanted to make it show up better. Okay, so we came up through the back, pulled it around over the edge, and then come up through the back again. Thank you for watching, and happy sewing.